I do, and I'm starting the broadcast now. Well, I thought I was starting the broadcast now. Just one moment.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, welcome, and thank you for joining us for the May installment of ILA's Leadership Perspectives webinar series. I am Ellen Van Velsor, Senior Fellow at the Center for Creative Leadership and member of the Board of ILA, and I will be moderating this webinar with Dr. Bruce Jackson, CEO of the Institute of Applied Human Excellence. Before we start, please note the following. First, this webinar will be archived. If you missed something, would like to hear the webinar again, or would like to see the presentation again, they will be published to the ILA website within 24 hours. You will receive an email with instructions for accessing the archived recording after the webinar has ended. Second, we welcome your questions throughout the webinar. At any time, you may ask questions by typing them into the question box of your webinar control panel, which is currently displayed on the right-hand side of your screen. We will address your questions during the second half of the webinar. Please note, however, that we may not be able to address each question we receive. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker. Dr. Bruce Jackson is a practitioner and student of applied human performance technologies. Searching for the common denominators of performance, Dr. Jackson has worked with young athletes, inner-city children, and Fortune 500 companies alike, recognizing that the principles of excellence and performance are as valid for the Olympic athlete, aspiring student, as well as the well-established CEO. Dr. Jackson is a certified member of the U.S. Professional Tennis Association and Professional Ski Instructors of America. He holds 3 master's degrees in counseling psychology, business administration, and organization development, and a PhD in human and organizational systems from the Fielding Graduate University, where his research identifies many of the core components and strategies that people use to search for and replicate their flow experiences. As I said, he's CEO of the Institute of Applied Human Excellence. His new book, Finding Your Flow, How to Identify Your Flow Assets and Liabilities, was written to help individuals, teams, and organizations increase performance within all levels of the organization. And just to remind you, there will be a drawing at the end of the webinar for a copy of that book. So at this point, I will turn it over to you, Bruce.
Great, thank you. Can everybody hear me? Just real check. Okay, so greetings, everybody. Glad to have you here today. This is always a fun opportunity to spend time talking about my favorite subject, which is flow and peak performance. I'll be taking you through a variety of content today, normally done in about 4 to 5 hours. And so my goal is to provide you with an overview of the Finding Your Flow book, as well as the 4 to 8 hour workshop that I conduct in corporate and university settings. So very quickly, as the folks mentioned, my background has been in psychology and business administration, etc. I spent about 10 years in the training and development industry, and then 7 years building a leadership institute out here in Utah. And my goal has always been to identify what are the common factors of peak performance. And as I studied early in my early life, I was very interested in the personal dimensions of leadership. How does one maximize their personal effectiveness? And then how does that work into interpersonal relationships? How does that work into team settings and even organizational settings? With that, there seemed to be some common principles that I was very interested in, and especially the applied side. There's so much theory with regards to personal leadership development. My goal was to really help and identify a model and method by which people could self-coach and become aware of these different dimensions that relate to peak performance and flow. So I'm going to go through a variety of topics here today that I hope will provide value to you, and at the end, for those of you who don't get your questions answered, feel free to send me an email or a phone call. So with that, I love this quote by Shakespeare that all the world is a stage. And as I've thought about the nature of performance, from athletes to fighter pilots to CEOs to accountants to stay-at-home moms and students and all types of folks, that we all are performers in our respective, what I call, meaningful life arenas, and that each of them provide a very unique space to perform, but most of the principles seem to replicate themselves over and over again. When I talk to corporate audiences, I ask them to talk about, what does it take for this woman right here to prepare for her sprint, to prepare for her race? And they'll talk about the fact that she's physically fit. She probably has a pretty clear goal in mind. She's probably mentally prepared. She's probably, developed some rituals and routines. And the lists go on and on. Most of us are familiar with a variety of these things. We just don't put them to very good use in our own lives very well. I was always intrigued about the success of the Olympic athletes of the 1960s, especially from East Germany and Russia. And a lot of people will say, well, the reason why they won so many gold medals was because they were doping and things of that nature. But that's not completely true. What the Russians and the East Germans started doing before a lot of the rest of the world in the Olympics was they were linking their technical training, their sport, with mental and emotional training. They recognized that to become the best athlete in the world, it was more than just technique. It was more than just new knowledge. It was a matter of preparing themselves mentally, emotionally, oftentimes philosophically, even spiritually, so that their blend of technique and their skill would mesh with the peak performance strategies to help them become at their very best. So with that, I like to separate this out, and I think this is an important thing to do in any arena of high performance, is to separate out that which is technical knowledge, represented here by TK, versus what I call flow knowledge. And as we go through this now, you'll recognize why I use flow as the core theory, primarily because almost all the core principles and theories seem to be sitting right underneath this theory of flow. And that technical knowledge isn't enough. That knowledge linked with flow knowledge, when you put them together, produces what I call the X factor in an individual, that blend of technical skill and training with the training related to personal flow development. So here we are with our corporate athlete preparing to run his or her race. Once again, the technical arenas are very, very different. Accountants, lawyers, teachers, engineers, all of their technical arenas are extraordinarily very different. Everybody learns and applies what they have acquired in their life technically, but the interesting thing is the peak performance principles remain the same regardless of technical arena. So with that being said, I like to consider what I call the dual regression equations of linking technical knowledge and flow knowledge. For those of you who understand regression equations, it's very simple. Essentially, there are many elements that contribute to the impact of a technology, etc. And so this first line represents technical competence. And factor 1, x1, x2, x3, x4, x5, those are the different technical competencies, each one of them adding some overall value to produce an output. And then below that is the idea of a flow equation, that there are a variety of peak performance principles that each contribute to the idea of maximizing performance. So the premise of this book and program is that peak performers focus both on the technical skill, but also on their personal leadership and personal performance skills. The thing that makes this interesting is if you look at equations, you'll recognize that some things are more important than others. And here is just a simple representation that you may technically be doing 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 things that create an overall impact of your performance. But some of those factors are much more important than other factors. From a sales standpoint, you may have 5 or 6 core competencies in sales. You may learn how to close, ask questions, identify the value proposition, etc. But there are some things that are more valuable than other things when it comes to technique or technology. And same with flow. And we'll recognize this through the slides that there are literally hundreds of variables that can contribute to this idea of peak performance and focus. But for you today, in your current meaningful life arena or space, some of these variables, some of these things are more important than others. And it's my goal for you today to help you find your personal formula and to identify what it is you need to work on today. So with that, the purpose of this program, when I deliver it in the corporate setting or the university setting, is to recognize that your moments of success and failure reveal your potential. And I'm going to walk you through a brief exercise here in a few minutes. That all of your meaningful life arenas, they provide a context for finding your flow. My goal is that you understand that there are core principles, that there are systems and processes, and especially practices for finding your flow, and that they're very personal to you. To assess your personal assets and liabilities and to develop your own personal flow formula. Really what this program is all about is helping you develop a higher level of awareness to put all these variables out on the table and to identify what your personal formula is all about. So, and also to plan your flow training mission. Sorry, I see that there's a few graphics coming up here. Please ignore those. It's my Dropbox uploading a bit. But then to apply strategies for increasing flow in your current meaningful life arenas, and then to transfer, that knowledge can be transferred from one meaningful life arena to another. And then the best part is to evolve, to recognize that when you learn to find flow in one arena, that you can transfer this methodology to any arena of your life. And also, I find it important to really contrast the boat from the wake. And I use it as a metaphor. I love this John Wooden quote where he says, "As my leadership matures, I stopped selling winning, avoided even saying the word, and began selling a set of principles and values that are the prerequisites for achieving success." When I talk to folks who really want to improve their performance, oftentimes they're thinking of some type of outcome. They want more money, they want better relationships, they want more success, etc. But they don't recognize that they are the vessel to producing that. And so the goal is process and practice, allowing the result to show up through process and practice. Okay, so with that, looking under the hood of your Ferrari, my question to corporate audiences is, when Henry Ford produced the first Model T, how many parts existed in the car? And a lot of people give some really, really good guesses, but it's a little over 4,000 pieces. You look at the modern-day Ferrari or any advanced car, if you pull out all the mechanisms of computer mechanisms, etc., you're looking at multiple thousands of pieces. And so my question to an audience is, I put them in teams and I ask them, if you each had the opportunity of winning a race with a car, each of you are going to get a car in a team of 4 to 5, and you have to decide what is important for this car to win the race. It's a straight race through the desert. What do you need? And through that conversation, people recognize that there are hundreds and hundreds of parts that they can throw out of their vehicle. They can throw out the cigarette lighter. They can throw out the floor mats. They can take partially the back seat. They can take all types of parts of the dashboard and things that lighten up the car. But there are certain things, of course, that they have to leave in place. Pistons and brakes and steering wheel, etc. And what they come to realize is that while there are thousands of parts that contribute to this vehicle's success and performance, that there are some vital parts, vital pieces that make the bulk of the value proposition for this car moving forward and performing well. And this is very much similar to individuals in identifying peak performance. There, of course, are, the human being is the most complex physical system in the world, with literally trillions of interconnected pieces from bone and sinew and to synapse through the brain. And so we're highly, highly complex. And so looking under the hood of your Ferrari is a lot more complicated than it is just looking under the hood of a car. And so the whole notion of flow and being at your very best is highly complex. And so it's a very personal process, and one for which we're going to walk you through how to find that out for yourself. So some fundamental models I want to share with you before we jump into this, and this will help frame this conversation, is that the quality of individual, team, and organizational performance is directly related to where and when we place our attention and the duration of our attention. And this, to me, is one of the more profound notions of finding your flow and being in the zone and finding your moment. It's really about where and when we place our attention and how long do we place our attention there. And as we go through these slides, you'll see what I'm talking about. So this is a common model by Bob Nittifer, and he was working with athletes as a sports psychologist, and he recognized that athletes, when they execute a play, they tend to go through these 4 quadrants of focus. First, they might go through a broad external assessment of their environment. Then they may go through a broad internal assessment of making choices. Then they may go ahead and make a final decision, and then they take action. So they go through each of these 4 quadrants. I find when working with most audiences that most of us are really, really good at problem solving. This is the lower left quadrant. We're problem solvers, we're decision makers, we prepare, we plan to execute. We attend to on the other side, we attend to a target or a goal, we focus on vital and critical factors, and we execute. But we don't spend as much time on this internal broad or this external broad. So in external analysis, what is happening in my arena? I'm gathering information. What patterns, issues, or opportunities am I seeing to improve or to maximize performance? My internal analysis. What am I experiencing inside? Thoughts, feelings, physiology. How am I performing? What can I do differently to improve and influence my performance? This is what I call the strategic time. It's the pit stop time. When I've worked recently with executives at Morgan Stanley, I wanted to let them know that they're spending a lot of money to sit in a room with me for a day. And I asked them why would they spend upwards of a couple $1,000s of their time to be here. And I referenced the idea that Formula One cars, while they continue to internally and externally execute, they need pit stops to re-strategize, retool, and prepare to go into the race. And so this is the same with finding your flow. Most of us do not do a very good amount of broad internal and external assessment to identify what strategically should I do today, this week, and this month to execute my performance at my very best. Another element of focus is the idea of past versus present versus future, that there's a time to be spending thinking about future stuff, and there's time that we need to be focusing on past stuff. Now I'm going to build a composite here in a minute so you can see how all these different dimensions fit together, and you'll see that throughout the Finding Your Flow book and the workshop that my goal is to codify and bring together all the literature in human performance in approximately 12 different dimensions. And I'll show you those dimensions and then give you some ways of thinking about those dimensions. All of the questions in the book that help you with that, I haven't included those here today because those take about 30 minutes to review. But they're in the book, and I'm happy to talk through them. I'll walk you through them basically in the next 15 or 20 minutes. So the next model is this idea of narrow, broad, and narrow, that the goal of most individuals who are seeking high performance is to improve, to maximize their ability to be their best in any life arena they choose. To do that takes a fair amount of awareness building. Most of us turn our awareness off because we're constantly making decisions and executing on strategy. But to actually set aside some time for awareness building, this is really where the rubber meets the road. Most of the principles in flow people have heard about. They recognize vision, they understand goals, they understand time management, they understand the importance of physical fitness and wellness, building missions and visions and goals, managing attitude, having emotional resiliency, learning from past, developing self-confidence from historical execution, etc. But they don't use it very well, and they don't execute very well. So my goal is that really finding your flow is about setting the stage and having a constant plan every month or every quarter to address your single thing today. And then the idea of executing a plan. So with that, some of you may be familiar with the self-mastery model, that we begin our 4 stages by becoming unconsciously incompetent. And most of us are unconsciously incompetent in most things. We're very smart in some things, but it's the place where I don't know what I don't know. And when we find that we become aware of our gaps or what's missing, we become this beautiful place called conscious incompetence. I now know what I don't know. And I ask audiences, what is special about conscious incompetence? It usually draws some chuckles. But the idea is now I have the choice to identify a gap and to create a very clear plan for closing that gap. Once you're able to close that gap, you're developing this idea of conscious competence. I now can do the thing I didn't know before, and over the course of time, you become unconsciously competent, basically developing new habits. I have mastered a new skill and developed a new habit. So with that in place, defining your flow process is pretty simple. It begins with self-awareness. It begins with personal data gathering. How do we do that? I call it the 720-degree sweep. It identifies a series of questions, about 60 questions, which helps you take a look at your external environment, like what's immediately surrounding you in a particular space, as well as your internal environment, and to start identifying where your assets and liabilities are. To then do some planning around that. You'll find that when you do the 720-degree sweep, you make long lists of your assets and liabilities, but there comes a point where you have to cut off almost all of them and boil it down to the 1 or 2 elements that will make the biggest difference in your personal performance enhancement. And then from there, it's learning how to act on new knowledge. It's execution and practice. And then from there, evaluation. We do that through a scorecarding process. And then over the course of 30 to 90 days, developing new habits, and then going back around to self-awareness so that you have a model for self-coaching for life. The reason why I produce this whole idea of finding your flow is because after reading several hundred books and going through multiple degrees, I recognize that there are so many models and methods for very specific things in training. But there's never really been a good book out there that says, hey, before you even get started on anything related to personal leadership development, you need to develop enough awareness so that you identify your one thing. Most people show up in training programs because their boss bought the program, it sounded interesting, their friend went, whatever. I find that about 80% of the people in the room are often there for reasons other than it's the right training at the right time in the right space. So finding your flow is designed to empower the individual to develop a level of awareness that allows themselves to identify what they need to learn today to maximize their performance. So with that, I'm going to go ahead through this experience because when I do this in a workshop format, my goal is that everybody has a chance to tap into their worst performance moments in life as well as their best performance moments in life. And normally I would do this over about 20 minutes, but I'm going to go ahead and have you just simulate this activity. My goal is I want people to understand that they can be their own scientist, that by asking themselves some very important questions, they can tap in to negative performance. Now, why do I want people to tap into negative performance? Because when they tap into it and can identify the principles at play in that performance, they can recognize that a negative performance and a positive performance are often in the same arena and using the same principles, but most of the time the principles are absent when they're in this negative space. And so I have folks close their eyes, and I'll have you do the same, and we'll just kind of go through this rather quickly. But close your eyes and think of a time where you were totally overwhelmed with your work or your life. You lacked interest in what you were doing. What you were doing had little or no value to you. Time stood agonizingly still. You felt a sense of frustration or fear. You were not on purpose. There was a disconnect between your mind, your heart, and your body. You were overly self-conscious. There was a sense of self-doubt, and you couldn't wait to do anything else. So, with that experience, I have individuals break up in teams of 3 to 5, and I say, where did this experience take place? What was the arena, and what were the principles at play? And of course, people have dozens of things. They didn't like the people they were around. They hated their boss. They didn't get enough sleep. Their nutrition was poor. They didn't have much energy. They didn't know why they were there. All types of things show up. We talk about that for about 15 minutes and really give them a chance to recognize that even their worst moments of performance are highly instructive to them. But from there we go to the fun stuff. So let's close your eyes one more time. Here is the flow experience. Think of a time where your mind wasn't wandering. You were not thinking of something else. You were totally involved in what you were doing. Your body felt good. Nothing seemed to bother or get at you. You were less aware of your problems and yourself. The stars seemed to align and everything just fell into place. You seemed to have all the skills you needed to do the job. You felt highly energized to be doing what you were doing. You didn't see yourself as separate from what you were doing, and time seemed to fly by. Now those are beautiful, majestic moments in our lives, and again, they are highly instructive. Teaching the workshop attendee to be their own best social scientists is one of those skills that everyone should acquire to learn from their own experience. So with that, we identify once again, where did these moments take place and what were the principles at play? They recognized that we could go through these lists hour upon hour and recognize hundreds and hundreds of things that contribute to their performance. So my goal is, let's get to work and identify your one thing today. To do that, I usually give a background of the flow research. I mean, this is one of the most highly researched topics of positive psychology. Original research was done by Dr. Csikszentmihalyi, and it's easy to pronounce. It's 4 syllables, Csikszentmihalyi. And I was lucky enough to have Dr. Csikszentmihalyi as my examiner on my doctoral thesis. And my premise was, we call him Mike, that I didn't want to just get theoretical about flow. I want to know how people can use flow and practically move their lives forward because they have very clear and precise tactics to do it. So the original research started in the early 60s where he started looking at artists who could work on a canvas for hours upon hours without paying any attention to the bathroom or food. They were completely, totally focused in this moment. Talked to surgeon, athletes, leisure activities. Over the past 40 years, thousands of articles have been written in dozens of books as diverse from children to teenagers, adult populations, the elderly. There's hardly a demographic that hasn't been studied. And what makes flow unique is that it seems to be a common experience that people have around the world, no matter what their age is, no matter who they are and what they do. So the value of flow theory is that it provides a context for understanding the key variables and factors of high performance and life satisfaction in any meaningful life arena you choose. So what do the books say? I'm going to summarize all the books in terms of what the core methods are, the core strategies are. Number one, when people are in flow, they tend to have clear goals and objectives. Number two, the activity provides unambiguous feedback, meaning people execute, they get feedback, and they adjust. Number three, the individual feels a sense of control where their awareness and their actions merge together. Number four, the individual experiences limited distraction and high concentration power. 5, when people are in flow, their performance seems effortless. They have extra energy. Number 6 is kind of a unique one. We spend some time talking about this altered sense of time. When people are in the zone or in flow, they often notice that time speeds up. In other cases, they can slow time down. Number 7, a loss of ego awareness, where you're so completely absorbed in the activity that who you are kind of drifts in the back. And number 8, the activity is intrinsically motivating, meaning it's something you do for the love of what you do and not because you're being rewarded outside of yourself. And number 9, the activity provides a context where the individual's perceived challenges and perceived skills meet. This is the common model that people who read flow will recognize, that there is this corridor when you have this beautiful blend of capability and skill linked with just enough challenge from lower left to upper right, whether you're sweeping a floor or solving a simple math problem or running the United States, that anybody and everybody can find this corridor of flow when their perceived capabilities and skills match their challenges. If their challenges are greater than their skill, they have anxiety and worry. If their perceived capability and skill is higher than their challenge, then they get bored, which leads to anxiety. So learning how to up that or lower that is a vital skill for finding your flow. So my research, what made this a little bit unique is I wanted to know specifically what people did to find their flow. I interviewed 64 official individuals and dozens of others to identify more than 128 different arenas where people experience their best self, and of over 158 different core strategies. Over the course of the last 7 years and applying this and organizing it, I've tried to boil this down to what I consider the 60 essential questions to identify where you are when you want to find flow in any meaningful life arena. Here's a brief model that I originally came up with, and then I've modified it a bit. I'm just going to go through this very quickly. The top 3 boxes represent external strategies. On the left-hand side is choosing the right environment, having the right physical space to be focused. The middle one represents environmental regulation, is how you manage your physical environment to be flow conducive. The right side is all the people stuff, the interpersonal side of flow. A lot of people talk about flow personally, but a lot of people talk about flow interpersonally. When they work in dyads or work in teams, there's a synergy there. It's the same concept, just with multiple people. So there's a variety of interpersonal dynamics to flow. Going down to the feet there by the Vitruvian Man are the physical strategies, everything from lowering your arousal to raising your arousal for energy level, your emotional strategies, building emotional resiliency, psychological strategies, everything from goals to self-talk to focus to visualization, core philosophical strategies, beliefs, principles, attitudes, perspectives, rules and standards, etc. And then spiritual strategies. A number of the folks that I interviewed talked about their interest in prayer and developing humility and deeper purposes of self and life that all contributed to their flow. And then at the bottom, everything from personal management strategies, living a balanced life, sleep, nutrition, physical fitness, how people then prepare to enter flow in terms of strategic planning or getting ready for a performance moment. And then at the very top of that pyramid, effort regulation, like when you're in the zone, how do you manage that? How do you manage and sustain flow over the long term? While tweaking and playing with this model for years, I've boiled it down to these 12 dimensions, and this really frames the book. This model for me is how people can make sense of all of that peak performance literature out there and to recognize where the literature fits and how it makes sense around the flow model. And I'll walk you through that in a minute here. So to do that, my goal is to get the group, now that they're pumped up and ready to recognize, gosh, they've had these poor experiences in life, they've had these exceptional experiences in life, now let's identify something today. And I have them pick a particular meaningful life arena, whether it's a work arena, whether it's family, whether it's a sport or a hobby. You have to, flow is very context specific, and it's based on context and time. And your flow formula may change month by month by month. So the critical thing is to make sure that you have enough awareness to know what you should be working on now. So with that, the 720-degree sweep, as I mentioned, is designed for the individual to assess their own internal climate for flow, as well as to look at their external environment and to find out in both areas, inside and outside, what are my assets, what are my liabilities, and how do I boil these things down to identify my one thing. So I usually tell the audience at this point that my goal is to overwhelm them, that I want them to feel comfortable in overwhelm, because once we push them on overwhelm and raise their level of awareness, then very quickly we start chopping it all down and boiling it down to a very focused one thing and a very clear plan of action. Now, we can't do all that today in an hour, so I'm going to go through this rather quickly so you get the idea of the framework. And once again, if you want the book, I'm happy to purchase the book. If you want to talk to me personally, you can call me on my cell phone. I'm happy to take personal phone calls on behalf of ILA. And I also will mention this at the end. I've put together a weekly newsletter. There'll be 60 newsletters that are going out on each question of the 720-degree sweep, and you can sign up for that newsletter for free on my website at theiahe.com. That's all in the end here, so let's keep going. So, assessing the variables of personal flow. This is where we get into the flow inventory. My goal is to ask very simple questions. Now, these questions are not complicated. You'll see some of these questions on standard 360s. You'll see them on other standard psychometric instruments, but they represent the core strategies that I discovered were most prevalent when people claimed to be in flow and said that they had personal strategies to help them get into it and or sustain it. So, a couple questions. A flow asset. How effective are you at managing your time? Time management is a big subject. Once again, we're staying big picture stuff here until people actually find their one thing and dig a little deeper. So, how effective you are at managing your time in this particular arena? If it's a 10, it's a high asset. It's something that is your core and great strength. And flow liabilities. How effectively are you tapping into a force or a purpose that is higher than yourself? And that's a 1, so that would be an extreme liability, and then everywhere in between. So in covering these questions, I'm going to go through a little bit more in depth on what are the kind of questions that show up in each of the 12 dimensions. So I'm going to basically summarize the 60 questions by talking through the 12 dimensions of the model. So first is the extended environment, the upper dimension here. This is your big space. This is this is where you are in your city, your county, the company you're in. I was recently working with some folks who really couldn't figure out where their interference was, and one of the answers was, boil down, I just don't think I belong in this particular environment, this company. It's not the right company for me. So whether it's the company, whether it's your house, whether it's your city or state, I have found that when people are in the right macro environment, it contributes to them having higher levels of focus and flow. The next is the immediate environment, and this is your immediate physical space. For me right now, I'm sitting in my office here in Highland, Utah, and my immediate physical space is my desk and my 2 computers and my bookshelves, and this immediate space needs to be fully organized in a way that's conducive for me to be utterly focused in what I'm doing today. So before I came in here this morning, I organized things so that my attention was solely on this computer screen and being prepared to speak to you today. Long future. This is the area where people do their strategic long-term work. This is where your missions come from, your visions come from, and your legacies come from. And so this is the really broad, long-term, abstract picture of where you're going and why you want to be there. From there, we back into your short future. And that's how do you plan and execute goals hour by hour, day by day, week by week, month by month, etc. And it feeds into your long future. Again, there's more than one or two questions per topic. I'm just giving you a brief overview of how these all fit together and how I've put the literature together underneath the topic of flow. The next one is your short past. And this is the quadrant where individuals need to be gathering feedback loops, where they're executing and they are learning from experience. They're constantly drawing from their immediate experience. I was working with some military folks, and they have what's called the after-action drill. And the military does so many wonderful things with leadership, and I looked at their after-action drill cards. They do not do a simulation or a drill where at the end of it they are constantly assessing themselves on how did it go, what could we improve, and they have a variety of measures to make sure that when they've performed in the moment, they know how to capture that learning and get feedback from that learning. The next one here on the left is what I call the long past. This is where traditional psychology over the last 50 years has had most of us hang out, which has been found over the last 15 years to provide a big problem for a lot of folks, that spending too much time in the deep past can actually just be building deeper ruts on old and negative behavior. But long past is very important. It is important to draw from your past important and core lessons that you want to bring to the future. It's also one of the main places by which you improve your self-confidence. One of the activities that I have my students and colleagues do is what I call a self-confidence audit, where I have them identify from when they were kindergarten age, 5 years old to yesterday, and I have them identify a minimum of 100 of their best moments of performance in life. I have them identify where did this take place, what specifically made it a successful moment, and write as much detail as you can about that. And you can imagine the first 50 aren't that hard, but getting to 100 gets a little harder for folks. I got to tell you, if you have that list of your best memories of success, it is a constant reminder for you to improve your performance long term. Okay, going down to the physical fitness area. The idea of sleeping well, rest and recovery strategies, nutrition, physical fitness. This is an important area for most of us. The next is the emotional dimension, learning how to become aware of and manage your personal emotions and develop resiliency around your emotions. Next is your psychological skills. This is everything from your goal setting to time management to mental models for attitude, perspective development, rational emotive therapeutic techniques of learning how to table negative emotion, find their distortion, and rewriting those are all on the mental side of things. Then we get into the philosophical dimension, and I've boiled this down to identifying for you, outside of the spiritual, your core beliefs, certain principles you live by, attitudes and perspectives or ways of seeing, rules and standards or ways of acting, and qualities and virtues of ways of being. And we do a trip every year to Peru, and we're doing some trips to Colorado and Arizona to help people identify their core philosophy, and more of that at the end. And then the spiritual dimension, once again, connecting people with their conception of a higher being or higher purpose. That doesn't necessarily have to be God, but for many people it is, but for others it's a way of tapping into nature or tapping into a divine space that allows them to see something that's bigger than themselves. And so the premise of finding your flow, and this is really it right here, that when you have most of these dimensions working for you, then you are allowing yourself to be in this moment in time, this flow space. Flow is nothing more than being completely absorbed right now in the moment. As I've spoken with hundreds of sports psychologists and Olympic athletes and others, and I've asked them, what takes you out of your flow? Well, I didn't get enough sleep last night. I didn't learn from that last mistake. Or I was completely unorganized today. Or I was unprepared. Or I don't know why I'm doing this anymore. Or I'm unclear of my goals today. It's all interference. It's all stuff that takes them out of their middle space. And so all of these 12 dimensions, really the 11 dimensions which lead to the middle, which is flow, all of these dimensions either act as assets or they act as liabilities. but most people don't really spend the time to identify what their assets and liabilities are. So that is the purpose of finding your flow. Once we go through those 60 questions, and after those 60 questions, I ask each person to say, listen, this is just scratching the surface. These are 60 questions that I have identified are valuable for people. What other questions, what other assets or liabilities do you see in your physical or space or emotional space that you think are an asset and a liability? And I have them add to the list. Once we get that list built, this is where we're just doing the work now. I ask them to identify what their flow assets are. Their flow assets are basically their 10s and their 9s, maybe their 8s. And their liabilities are their 1s and their 2s, maybe their 3s. Once they create that list and they start seeing that all of my assets contribute to my flow and all of my liabilities push back on my flow, the goal next is to say, great, now let's start chopping this down. Let's start narrowing our guidelines here and let's really do something with it. So I do this personal force field flow analysis worksheet, which allows them to start seeing their assets and liabilities as a large list. At this point, it's the idea that your personal formula is nobody else's but yours. I've talked to sports psychologists who are, of course, looking for the grand formula of how do I find flow. Is there a formula? And my answer is, of course there's a formula. But it's your personal formula, and it's nobody else's formula. So the goal is, how do I find mine? So in building flow, I have them basically just boil it down to their number 1s and their number 10s. If they have multiple 1s, then they start from 1 and go to 2, 3, 4. If they have multiple 10s, they go from 10 to 9 to 8, and they sort them out. Their personal flow formula is very simple. I have boiled down flow to be your flow assets, your internal assets plus your external assets divided by your internal liabilities and your external liabilities. Your goal with the list that you've produced is to literally fill out this form with no more than 5 topics per area. This is still a lot of stuff. This is 20 variables, 20 things that can contribute to flow or hinder flow. So here's an example of building your flow formula from the questions. Internal assets may be intrinsically motivated, high energy, clear mission and vision, physically healthy, positive attitude. External assets may be there's an entrepreneurial spirit here, I have supportive leaders, organized workspace, ample feedback, organization is consistent with my values, etc. And below are all the different liabilities you can look at. The goal is to help individuals recognize that there is one core thing that they need to identify. And I usually tell a story, and it's in the book, about Dan Jansen and when he fell his first time in the Olympics, what was going on in his head when he fell, and then when he went to his second Olympics and fell again. And then finally in his third and final Olympics, what did it take for him to win the gold medal? And it was this singular focus on one technique and one emotion. So with that, there's basically 3 ways to improve flow, to maximize flow. Number 1, you can maximize or strengthen a flow asset. You can fortify a strength. But if you look at the denominator, you can decrease a liability. You don't have to be great at your liability, but if you can decrease it slightly, if you just do the math on any mathematical equation, when you mess with the denominator, it proves very powerful to improve the answer. And then for some, because most of these skills we're talking about are highly learnable and can be acquired, they're not genetically predisposed to anybody, but if you can transform a flow liability to an asset, you get 4x on your results. So much of the leadership literature now is focusing on strengths-based stuff, and that is great. We all need to be pushing our core strengths. However, and I know from Jack Zenger and others who talk about you got to take care of your major flaws. I think there's a balance between focusing on core strengths and, yes, letting go of things that are not your strong suit, but most of these peak performance strategies are automatically learnable. They're not terribly difficult to learn, and they do have great benefit long term. So in this particular flow formula, time management may be their number one. It may be their highest liability that they want to do something with that. And at that point, it's all about action planning. It's about moving from conscious incompetence to a higher level of conscious competence. Sometimes it's a skill gap in people where they don't know what they don't know and they need more training. Other times it's simply a behavioral gap and they haven't committed to digging the ditch and really getting the work done. So my goal is finding the critical factor and filling out their personal plan of action. Very simple plan of identifying one goal that will close your largest performance gaps. What is your one thing, and using the SMART criteria to help people really energize around it. Here is the sheet that I've produced. They can produce either a flow asset or a liability, and once they identify their SMART goal for that change, they can put it through the gauntlet to make sure that it in fact meets the criteria of effective goal setting. Once we get started with that, here's just some example of SMART goal examples. A lot of individuals still get stuck on very vague or not very important goals, and so we spend a little bit of time talking about what is a good goal and what makes a long-term successful goal. But once we do that, usually at this point we break for lunch and we start spending our afternoon on personal scorecarding. And my goal with scorecarding is to help individuals identify what are the inputs that you can measure that will produce an output you can measure. And we create a simple scorecarding process where they can now track whether it's, everything from calories to smiles per day to number of pages per week read to number of positive conversations to how many times have I engaged somebody in feedback to whatever it is. We want them learning how to count that what it is they want to improve upon, and we provide a variety of scorecards to help them track that. And then the final exercise we do is the idea of my best and my worst. It's a very short exercise which individuals can share with their friends, their colleagues, their family members, which basically says, this is what I need to perform at my best, this is where I struggle when I perform at my worst, and how can you help support me in my long-term quest for peak performance and flow. And then the last part is this idea of self-mastery and going back to this idea of unconscious incompetence and to recognize that we can do this model over and over and over again. To simplify this all down, to boil it all down, I've boiled it down to what I call the essential 21 questions that you can ask yourself every month to see very briefly if there's an area where you may be having assets or liabilities and where you need to be replacing your attention. And these are those questions here. Let's see here. To kind of close this out, I know we want to do a Q&A session here pretty quick. The complexity of flow is extreme. It took 25 years of reading research and hundreds of interviews and dozens of workshops to have the conversations to recognize that no matter what performance arena that you're living in, there are so many different things that you need to be aware of in order to understand what makes you tick, what makes you find your best stuff. And to do that takes awareness, and it takes some structure, and it takes some strategy. My goal for finding your flow and the workshop was to empower people to simplify the model, to recognize that there are various areas in which you can assess yourself, whether you're doing well or not doing so well, and to empower them to find their one thing. And whether it's go get a new book, go get some additional training, it's really designed for the individual who wants to take control of their own personal leadership development. It perfectly situates itself in sort of corporate universities where they want to empower their employees to think for themselves about their long-term personal development. I boiled this down to this idea of building your architecture of experience, that literally all these different variables contribute to entering this M, which is your single moment of performance. All we have every day are singular moments of performance, and how we enter those and how we execute those. And if you look at the bottom here, you'll see that your life is a collection of moments. And if I've calculated this out, but if you died on your 90th birthday on the hour of your birth, you have 788,400 of these little units to live by. And learning to recognize the principles that contribute to every moment of performance, where you are in the moment when you are at work or at lunch or in a conversation, is where I want folks to recognize that they have the control to find more flow and build more flow.
Bruce, this is Ellen. I'm cutting in here because we have only a couple of minutes left. Could you take a couple of questions at this point?
Absolutely. Let's go ahead and do it there.
Okay, so we do have a handful. First one, someone's wondering if it's more difficult to experience flow in certain arenas, and if so, what arenas have you found are most difficult?
Well, that is very much based on the individual. I mean, there is research there, most people in most countries claim to be relatively happy. There are some countries with severe political distress where people are struggling with flow just as a whole. I think, that's the macro, that's the external environment, that's the big environment stuff. But I think the environments where people struggle with flow are ones where the immediate physical space is not conducive, and that can be, loud environments, hot environments, environments where people are coming in and out of the room. It really has to do with all the potential distractors that can show up. And whether that's ugly carpet or whether that's heat in a room, whether that's being next to a factory floor, it really has to do with how many things are going on in the environment, and then how well can you learn to pay attention to the one or two things that make a big difference. So it really has to do with how much control you have over your environment.
And then a second question, are all the elements of focus necessary, and what happens when our focus is on the lower quadrant only or primarily?
Are they talking about the personal side, like the physical, emotional, psychological, etc.?
Yeah, I think so. The upper quadrant and the lower quadrant that you showed earlier.
Yeah, that happens to a lot of folks. I mean, my goal was to take a very broad, many different literature bases and codify it into 12 dimensions. Any one of these dimensions can be the thing that pulls you out of flow. Whether that's outside of yourself, whether that's inside of yourself, whether that's your past, whether that's your future, all of these areas are simply designed to ask you questions so that you can say, okay, if I, for example, am really struggling with high anxiety, it's an emotional issue, and when I get into performance moments, I have high anxiety, that becomes the area of your focus. And so you now want to become an expert on EQ, on building emotional resiliency. So these questions are really designed to help you identify the one area and then begin your homework to say, okay, this is really what's going on. What do I need to do to close the gap?
Okay, at this time, I would like to bring a close to the questions. So thank you, Bruce, for taking the time to be with us today. I'd like to now announce the winners of the book giveaway. 3 of today's participants were randomly selected to receive a copy of Bruce's latest book. They are Catherine Bingham, Jess Lamphere, and Michelle Farmer. So congratulations. And if you enjoyed today's webinar, I hope you'll also be able to join us for the next installment of the Leadership Perspectives webinar series. Please visit www.ila-net.org for more details. Have a good day.